I'm going to address the fears that we all have, that I have, I think, every time I get on a boat, which is, will I do the right thing? Will I do the right thing? Will I instinctively do the right thing? Well, there's no instinct. Perhaps the only instinct is that you won't allow yourself to be thrown overboard. Will my experience and my training lead me to do the right thing? Well, you hope so, but you can't say that for sure, because every situation on a boat is really different for most of us who just go out a few days a year, a few weeks a year. Then the next question is, will my team's leaders and the routines and the mutual responsibility of the system on the boat lead me to do the right thing? And that's where you place your greatest hope, I think. You are thinking about that the structure will help you and move it along. And I think that's a reasonable expectation. Let me tell you a story that I haven't told anybody, and I expect nobody will tell it outside this room, which is that coming back from Bermuda a few times ago, we were running under, before it, in a, well, the owner of the boat's in this room, I think. Anyway, a 40-footer or so, going very fast, and before it got dark, I suggested we roll up the jib. We were going fast enough under main alone. Then in the middle of the night, there was a great bang, and I came on deck, and lo and behold, the headstay had parted company. The turnbuckle had broken, and the headstay with the rolled-up jib was flying around. I was feeling very happy about the decision I'd made, and I'm quite confident at this time, and I went forward with another guy, and we grabbed the jib to keep it from wrapping around the spreaders and tried to figure out how to control it, and eventually we pulled it forward with a preventer and pulled it right up the headstay. And it was late at night, and wasn't anything else we could do. We weren't going to be messing with cotter pins and clevis pins at that time. We were sailing comfortably, so we waited till daylight to fix it. We made that decision. Well, having done this, all these great acts, and that I was very proud of, I started to go below, and I pulled a safety harness, which I thought I'd clipped onto the boat, and it came right up. I'd been sitting on the safety harness shackled at a clip the entire time, and I hadn't hooked on. And that's when you feel like an idiot. But that's the sort of thing that happens. One good decision, the next one isn't so good. And that's where the structure, I think, the seamanship structure, the organization on the boat makes all the things. We have all done dumb things on boats. The trick is we don't want them to be super dumb. And that's where organization comes into play. Let me tell you a bit about how sailors are hurt. Most injuries, these are Coast Guard figures, most injuries are just like home. They're falls, they're slips, they're scrapes. Your hands I broke a finger just this past year banging it against the refrigerator. I could have done it on a boat. Our heads, our shoulders. We hope that it isn't a big head injury if you have it. Usually it isn't. You hope there's nothing broken. Sailors are hurt often because they're undisciplined and unfocused. They may be seasick. And I'm going to mention seasickness several times tonight because I think not enough is said about seasickness. The crew is disorganized, so sometimes crews are banging into each other and disorganized, getting the jib up or getting the jib down or tacking. And we get unfocused, and we get complacent, which is the worst thing, and we get very, very cocky. And as my mother used to say, you get dumb, D-U-M, dumb. She was from Texas. D-U-M, dumb is always running through my head when I make this kind of mistake. We get distracted. What distracts us? 5 minutes to go off watch, or 5 minutes since we came on watch, we're half awake, waiting for the coffee. Angry at the helmsman isn't steering quite well enough, annoyed at this, annoyed at that. We get preoccupied, we get uncomfortable. Again, we get seasick because we're passive or we're not taking care of ourselves. And we might get hypothermic as well, which doesn't add to the facility. Even in the Gulf Stream, you can get that. And then we get exhausted. And there's a rule here, which is very simple. Real sailors take naps. And the macho thing just doesn't work. Doesn't work. It may work for the professional sailors, and I'm not sure when Rich sleeps. He tells me he sleeps, but he has a system that he uses. And we lose our situational awareness, and we're not to that stage where the fear presses us to get our act together. There's that stage you're kind of floating between Complacency and fear, and you're just not ready to be brought to task. The factors in accidents, the Coast Guard tells us, is alcohol is number one. They're talking about powerboats as well as sailboats. We know it from our own experience. They think they have said that it's the lead factor in 20% of deaths on boats. Another factor is just boats that are unseaworthy. They don't belong out there. Or there are breakdowns, or there's broken gear, or we use the wrong gear. We put the wrong sheet on the sail. We might use the wrong block for a turning block. And then we just don't know the boat very well. We don't have the basic skills down. And then there's weak leadership and inadequate and untrained and unsupervised crews. And we've all had experiences with that, which is why Bermuda race boats go on the Block Island race before they head out. Or why we worry a little bit more about the return trip with a pickup crew than we would with a racing crew going down. And the leadership, the training that leaderships bring, and the state of mind that good leadership brings and organization brings is what I want to talk about now. There's this thing called complacency. There's operator inattention. Operator inattention is a technical term. It used to describe all sorts of things. I have a slideshow that I usually give with this talk, and it shows some sailor in a freighter who somehow missed the turn and he ended up with his bow 40 feet up on a sandy beach. That's, you might call operator inattention. We've all gone through it for one reason or another. Distraction, all the usual things that we have to avoid, the seasickness being one of them. And we don't have, I think that part of the complacency is we think they're advanced skills and basic skills. But the fact of the matter is, I think most of the ones that most of us sail with are actually basic skills, every single one of them. The advanced skills get into offshore racing of the kind that Rich does. But the fundamental skills are really fairly simple and take pretty much the same level of attention. And if we start to think that something is too advanced for us, then we're starting to get into trouble, because it probably isn't. We should bring it back to our level rather than try to reach towards that level. So here's my advice to a skipper before you head out. The skipper should have two discussions before heading out. The first discussion is with the crew. And the question might be, starting, this is how we're going to do this. He appoints officers, deck officers. He lays out ship's rules and procedures. He alerts people about equipment, though I have friends who suggest that you wait for the equipment review and the tour of the boat until you're well out there and the crew is away from shore and the excitement is worn off so they can focus on attention. My friend Spencer Smith, who's done a lot of offshore sailing, says wait till the next day before you start talking about fire extinguishers, because they're not really ready to hear it yet. In any case, that early discussion, that last pre-cruise before you get on the boat and head out, that the skipper has with the crew, talks about all of the things that are going to happen. This is how we're going to do set watches. This is how we're going to do our cooking. He's going to say something about, you're going to say something about the route, why we're taking this route and not some other route. And then he's going to start doing a checklist, a mnemonic that we use, that a good crew will have as it walks around the boat, the things to put in that checklist. Once the boat's settled down, you start doing the checklist and looking at the gear. That's the first discussion. And it isn't necessarily a social discussion. It's a boss talking to his employees. This is how we're going to do things. You have to practice it to say it as gently as you possibly can and make it acceptable. And if you find there's some resistance or lack of understanding, then you have to take somebody aside. But this is important if you're going to go out and do something rather long and adventuresome in a boat. The second conversation the skipper has is with him or herself. Why am I doing this? What do I want out of it? Am I expecting too much? Am I doing this for the wrong reasons? You have to work through all of those. Am I being too hard on these people or not hard enough? Am I being too hard on myself? Am I sleeping enough? Do I know that everybody on this boat has a problem with seasickness? In my experience in Bermuda races, seasickness is the common standard of any boat that gets into trouble. There's going to be some seasickness. You've lost not just one person, you've lost two people because the second person has to look after the first one. So there's that issue that affects the sleep. So the skipper is asking these questions. He's meditating on what is the purpose of this? What is the meaning of this thing we're doing, having gone through some of the details. And he or she is starting to talk about their own limitations, and you ought to have them out on your own table because you have to deal with people. I think that among the things that the skipper will now start doing is making what I call a four-handedness checklist. We had this remarkable character, John Bonds, who I did safety seminars with for 20 years. And he would talk about four-handedness as though it were religion, which is thinking ahead. There's a wonderful, the doctors have started to work in the four-handedness. Surgeons are thinking about four-handedness a lot. Here's a definition of four-handedness by a medical advisor. Four-handedness, anticipation and preparation for the uncertain future so that we are ready for it by the time it becomes the present. Anticipation and preparation for the uncertain future so we're ready for it by the time it becomes the present. Now, you would have to have some experience with this setting to know what that future might be and what the it looks like, what the shape of it is. But that is a terrific guide, a state of mind to have. Another way he just talks about it is taking error seriously means to first understand the domain in which it is said to occur. Taking error seriously means to first understand the domain in which it is said to occur. Where is the error starting? Is it mental? Is it physical? Is it interpersonal? In a boat, you have this extraordinarily dense, except in Rich's boat, dense interpersonal engagement in which things that can get light and get triggery about the third day if people haven't had enough sleep or it gets a little rough. That's when the captain has to be thinking about, and watch captains have to be thinking about the interpersonal aspect of it. So that's the four-handedness part, constantly having in mind what can go wrong. I remember once going down to Bermuda and going forward, as I do as a practice, every hour with a flashlight in my hand, crawling up on the windward side, showing the light on everything I could possibly see. And down in the leeward waterways, I saw a little piece of a glint of silver. And so I harness hooked on very carefully, slid down there, looked at the silver, and it was the cotter pin for the roller furler. It turned out to be the cotter pin for the roller furler. Roller furler wouldn't work. And this exercise of getting somebody on your watch, maybe alternating, it's a good thing because you want to have backups. Make this tour, flashlight in hand, lots of flashlights available, on the same route every time, looking at the same thing, making your four-handedness checklist as you check things off one by one. I find that is really helpful. It gets people engaged, gets people confident, and it catches things that you might not see, like that cotter pin. John Bonds used to call this the bosun's walkabout. Bonds would say, you get what you inspect, not what you expect. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. It's part of that discipline, the four-handedness discipline. That's the boat tour. And that's also the regular testing of pumps. You pump the bilge when you come off watch, not to get the water out of the boat, but to make sure the pump is working. I mean, there's a good place to start. And to check the electronics and to rotate the flashlights and all of those sorts of things you do on a routine trip. Complacency, lack of four-handedness. Joseph Conrad defined complacency, putting it this way in a sailor's term: a seaman laboring under an undue sense of security becomes at once worth hardly half his salt. A seaman laboring under an undue sense of security becomes at once worth hardly half his salt. The emphasis is on the at once. And we know how quickly things can fall apart when that happens. Thank you.
This is about decision making. The key role that every sailor needs to think about, whether you're on the receiving end of it or the contributing end of it, it's an important factor in a cohesive crew. What we're going to see tonight is reason behind the purpose of decision making and how a skipper needs to develop those skills and a crew needs to interact. It's not a one-way street. Decision making and leadership, two-way situation. The double-handed crew that's doing more cruising than racing relies on the same type of sensible decision making that the racing sailor deals with. The 10 years I spent at the U.S. Naval Academy as Advanced Star Chair taught me that sailboat racing and sailboat cruising are more than just the athletic side of it, the physical side of it, more than the tacking and jibing sets and preparation for heavy weather. It has to do with lessons learned underway and things that are learned prior to getting underway. It's the idea of what John Bond said, sailboat racing is battle without the bullets. How many of you remember Henry Morgan, retired two-star admiral, fine sailor, and a man that gave back to midshipmen as much as he took away from his career in the Navy as a submarine skipper? Underway, the midshipmen get a chance to develop both the tactical skills as well as what I call the civilian side of racing. The idea of sharing the line pulling, the trims, the sets, the jives, etc. One of the things I want to stress today is the idea that we blend the skills that we learn underway inshore, take them offshore, but offshore is a little bit of a higher order. I've had the good fortune to race and cruise and have a lot of what I call interesting inputs from sail anchors, from yacht designers, so on and so forth. But one thing I've learned along the way is I always listen to my wife. My wife has far more sense when it comes to time to tuck a reef in, or when we are going to get knocked down by some errant little thunderstorm cell that I feel is just going to breeze through. The platforms we sail on are important, and we need to be in phase with the boats that we sail. The new multi-hull era is upon us, and we're seeing reaching speeds in double digits, 20, 30 knots. A week ago was a sobering experience. The fine line that we monohull sailors have gotten away with for years, in other words, a little too much and a little too much wind, and we may be down on our rear, the spreader's in the water, but we come back up. The decision-making process with a multi-hull is a little more tenuous. The fine line between full speed and a test of the righting moment of the vessel comes pretty close. Today I'm going to raise a couple of suggestions on how to build your decision-making capability. The first is understand what the atmosphere is doing. And we have a unique opportunity in the form of having a National Weather Service and an Ocean Prediction Center that really has a recreational sailor in mind. Not just commercial traffic, but recreational sailors. And the effort of stakeholders, and there are several different groups of stakeholders. What I call the dean of stakeholders is Frank Boland. He's shown up at these meetings and he has built a liaison with the Ocean Prediction Center. His recent seminar success with sea state and weather. And mind you, that's a couplet that hasn't been made in the past, sea state and weather. The idea, it's not the wind that gets us, it's what? It's the breaking wave face or the green side of that ocean swell. So part of this decision making I'm referencing lies in understanding what the atmosphere holds and how it's going to be affected on the water surface itself. Sobering experience for all. We all as recreational sailors should understand one commercial incident, El Faro. It should stick in your mind because of the decision making that took place. El Faro's normal cruise between point A and B is a Jacksonville to San Juan, Puerto Rico run. The run is pretty much a milk run most of the time, but not in hurricane season. Hurricane Joaquin was going to intersect the track a couple of years ago as El Faro was making its way south. The master decided to make the run anyway. Many of the forecasters around the country were shocked at the idea that the vessel was going to head off on a southeasterly heading and literally disregard what the junior officers on board were saying. The third mate called the skipper and said, "Skipper, in 4 hours we're going to be in the eye of the storm that has 120 knots of wind in it. Carry on," was the response. The issue at hand is, where did that decision making come from? And recently the National Transportation Safety Board came up with their final review of the incident. The incident basically chronicled where the vessel was going, what decisions were made on board, and how all of this came about. Was there a lack of weather training? Yes, to a certain extent, despite the STCW courses, so on and so forth. How about flawed weather routing? Well, the weather routers were not necessarily all in consensus, but they were close enough that you knew this storm was brewing and trouble was on its way. The vessel's seaworthiness, it was 40 plus years old, but had passed ABS inspection, and it was up to the standards of the area it was transiting. It was not a hurricane-proof vessel. Bridge resource management. You had the junior officers, the third mate and the second mate, both querying why we were doing this. The master and the chief mate were both on board with, well, we'll just duck under it, going closer to the Bahamas. To the right, they had no place to go. Complacency, perhaps. The irony is the year before, the skipper had made a evasion route around Tropical Storm Erica. And that storm didn't matriculate into a deep Category 3 hurricane. The answer to what happened is pretty well pinpointed, that it was operator error. Yes, obviously the environment had a contingent factor role in that it was a hurricane and it was Category 3, and 120 knots of wind with higher gusts is very hard to survive when the vessel has no power left and things are going south. A minor league sequel, much less tragic, 1 loss of life rather than 33 losses of life, occurred on the West Coast with uncontrollable urge. A Columbia 32, with a boat builder on board, a crew of experienced offshore sailors, long-term sailors, headed out in the Around Islands race that left Catalina to port and then San Clemente to port and then into San Diego. The findings and summary of what went wrong during this event were pretty straightforward, and U.S. Sailing did a grand job on determining the major issues. There was a rudder failure. Literally, the rudder stopped sheared, no rudder. Then there was the efforts to jury-rig an emergency rudder, which didn't take place. At the same time, there was contact, the skipper had contact with the Coast Guard, saying basically that they needed a tow, they were looking for a tow, and they did not call the incident a mayday or emergency situation. The Coast Guard wisely said, keep radio communication with us, keep us updated, and we will respond according to your needs. There was no tow available. It was blowing 25 to 30. Towboat US out of Catalina wasn't going to send off a vessel. So in essence, as they drifted toward a lee shore, attempting to get steerage control, unable to implement the traditional spinnaker pole and locker door and towing warps and trying to steer by weighting and unweighting each rail, didn't work. They had power with the engine, but they had no ability to steer their way off the lee shore. And the lee shore kept growing closer and closer. Over a 2-hour period, they were getting precipitously close to imminent danger, and they still didn't call the mayday. Didn't call the mayday until the vessel grounded the first time, took the rig out of the boat, knocked down seriously. 3 of the crew were washed overboard. They were now obviously in extremis. One of the crew was caught on the edge of his tether. In other words, he was washed overboard he had a cow hitch in his tether and a small cutting device to release the tether. That didn't work, and he was there for quite a while. He finally was cut free by another crew member in the boat, and his inflatable was inflated. He was washed toward shore, and at that time, the two people still left on the boat lost sight of him. He was found floating inshore, sadly deceased. The inflatable PFD, both inflation bladders had shifted to one side of his head. Some big concerns about older inflatable designs. The U.S. sailing panel that reviewed this looked at it quite seriously, and some concerns in the industry came about, and a lot more attention is being given to bladder leakage, thigh straps or crotch straps that must be worn, and the whole situation of relying on an inflatable PFD in heavy breaking sea conditions. One downside, and we all need to think about this, is the manufacturer stated the device was never meant for such conditions. Well, if you find 8-foot seas in a shore break, that's nothing compared to a force 10 or 11 storm at sea when you have to abandon ship. So the idea of, are these devices rugged enough, so on and so forth. It's room for much more research and attention as we start to see occasionally these incidents occur. Oh, by the way, they had 2 anchors on board. One was 7 pounds and the other 11 pounds. As they approached the shore break, the anchors did far better catching on to kelp and dragging some kelp strands along with them rather than securing to the bottom. The findings here, U.S. Sailing did a great job in the report summary. A summation of it is, once again, operator error played a big deal. But in this case, it was like a domino theory. Broken rudder, not emergency gear for self-steering capability, equipment that didn't quite fit the needs of the situation, and the multiple effects brought things to a bad conclusion. Going to sea has some risk, no question about it. What type of sailing you do and how hard you push the accelerator, you need to have an understanding of what are my risks, what's the weather condition. And the person who gave me more insights into coping with heavy weather, Gulf Stream conditions, so on and so forth, was Rod Stevens. Rod understood feathering. He knew how to take a lot of wind without tucking a reef in, but he also knew to go to the masthead, check the rig, look at those cotter pins, clevis pins, so on and so forth. And then when you're at sea, get the person who's the least experienced, stick them on the helm, guide them through how to get from one point to the next, and be really aware of what a opposing wind and sea condition can do in the Gulf Stream. A man of knowledge who knew what he was doing. Took me 6 years to write the book, The Art of Seamanship. And in it I cover a lot of these one-off, what I call sea stories that have meaning. I remember Sheila's comments with regard to what seamanship really is. It's worth a read. So in conclusion, decision making, it's at the foundational level for safety at sea. You need to have a clear and concise understanding of chain of command. There should only be one person who makes those final decisions, because if it all goes south in Admiralty Court, they'll say, who was the person in charge? And they hold the, what I call, big jug of water on that one. Engage with the crew. Leadership is not one way, it's two-way. Dialogue is important. If nothing else, you're training the leaders of the future. Sound seaworthy vessel can't be overstated. The value of it can get you through conditions that you've made mistakes and found yourself crossways to the wrong wind, the wrong sea, so on and so forth. But through knowledge and awareness of the conditions around you and the conditions that are about to arise within the next 24 hours, you'll do pretty well. Chance favors the prepared mind, said Louis Pasteur, a biologist with a seaman's eye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. It's nice to be here. And I'm glad that Ralph brought up Ron Stevens, because I remember that after the Fastnet 79 episode, it was the first safety at sea sort of seminar here at the New York Yacht Club. And there were 5 or 6 speakers, and Rod got up and he said, I have 18 points. And he, what points do those? I only have 6 points.
What a wonderful era.
I'll just go through the thoughts that came to mind when John invited me kindly to speak here, sort of thoughts about seamanship and going to sea. On safety, a couple of small items. I think this ATCOM is essential for all of those who go on beyond the coastline, so that you can send photos back to your shore team, things are great. So you can send medical photos if you get hurt, had a bad injury in the first one in the world, had to connect with the emergency room at Tufts Medical Center in Boston, send pictures of that, plus obviously the weather. The first thing we did for both of the open 60s for both races was we took the lifelines and raised them from 600 millimeters to 800 millimeters. It changes completely your sense of safety on the foredeck to have that extra couple of 100 millimeters. And also, another item, we put lightning diffusers on both the boats. Both Great American 3 and Great American 4 were hit by lightning. The second was a direct hit in Marblehead Harbor. The first was a proximity hit, wiped out all the electronics. So, but we were able to replace that all in a shipyard. So if you had to do that at sea, you wanted to give yourself every chance you can to try to deflect that. The second point on seamanship, I'm not embarrassed to say at all, I bring fear into it all the time. At least fear keeps you on high alert. And obviously sailing in the open 60 alone, the boats are gigantic, they're monsters, you have to be on high alert all the time. To the extent that I'm approaching Cape Horn this last time, probably especially given my particular history of Cape Horn, even though we had a good forecast coming up, I still put the storm jib up, so I was ready to go, load the sheets and so forth, all ready to go just in case. It's Cape Horn. And back on the Cape Horn capsize, some of you will have known about that back in 1990. Where we were in a storm for 3.5 days, bare poles, dragging warps, finally capsized on Thanksgiving Day. Perhaps, I sometimes said that perhaps the best sailing we ever did was to keep that boat upright for those 3 days, 3.5 days. We did it by streaming warps, which aren't talked about too much. And that's a tactic that really worked well. Instead of a drove, which we used as well at sea, or a sea anchor, which we didn't have on board, we used warps. We strung out 5 lines, about 100 feet long each. They didn't do anything at first. We had hit 19 knots down a wave on a Monday morning with no sails up, and then we started to put out the warps, and it increased to 85 knots of wind on the Thursday when we estimated 55-foot seas, and the official estimate was 65-foot seas. And we finally capsized. And along the way, those warps, we brought the 5 back in and started to tie knots in them every 10 feet or so, put them back out. We got up to 8 warps, and they slowed the boat right down to 8 to 12 knots. So 8 knots up the seas, 12 knots down the seas. Under control, pulls the stern back into the seas, and as well pre-breaks the crests. We never had a wave proof the boat. So, seas might get up 12 feet high, just 6 feet back behind the boat, but those lines would pre-break the crests. So a nice tactic to use. On the topic of shore teams, because obviously preparing the Open 60 for the Vendée Globe, get the best people who know more than you do. And study all the topics, ask your questions, listen to their answers, and implement every good idea that comes along, big or small. We were lucky to have a guy named Joff Brown as our boat captain. He was English for this race. Murph Owen, who was the designer of the boat, had said, look, Brian, who I love in Maine, Brian Harris at Maine Yacht Center, did the refit for Great American 3 for the first Vendée Globe. This boat's more sophisticated. You're going to have somebody, people from France or England, to run this boat. And so we did. Joff had been a boat captain for 4 successful Vendée Globes, including he was a construction boss for the latest Hugo Boss build and also Aviva. He and his team would come over when we got the boat over here to the U.S., to Portland, to work with Brian and his team. And Brian loved it. Brian's the only guy in the U.S. who dealt with 3 round-the-world races all solo before we connected with him. So the shipyard, we had that expertise, and as well, the shipyard has to have, and the people working around it have to have, certainly for this case, but I think it applies to the full crew case as well, really the single-handed, the short-handed ethic. And that ethic is, if we the shipyard or we the short team make a mistake, the skipper might not come home. So everything has to be perfect, and we have to know how it works, we have to be accessible while we're at sea. So that was great, we had that, and I looked for a shipyard that has that short-handed ethic, where your boat's going to be special. And be one of your own preparators, work alongside the team, learn all the systems, learn the tasks, be able to do it as well as you possibly can. You won't be able to do it as well as the experts, but do as much as you can that way. And work those systems so you're familiar with them. So when things go bad, it's not the first time you've worked on something. On the topic of managing a crew, Ralph talked a lot about that already. It's been 20 years since I had 4 people on a boat. 30 years since we had 10 on Rousmaniere when we were lucky enough to win the Bermuda race. Just about how we did that, and I think Ralph was talking about this as well. Of the 10 we had on Rousmaniere for that, 6 of them had been transatlantic on the boat, so knew the boat offshore. Another subset of 6 were one design sailors from Marblehead that could make the boat go fast. And I made a list of the pros and cons of each person with their skills that I thought that they had, plus their personality traits, episodes that I knew about, and so forth. And I remember, I'm not just making this up now looking back, but I spent 40 hours going through putting different combinations of the watches together to get what I thought would be the perfect combination. And it turned out to be really good.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. Yeah.
With that, we had high skill level, unselfishness, 30 minutes maximum steering per helmsman, only 2 helmsmen per watch, or 4 people. There would be, and then switch off because they were the highest skills, and obviously it worked out. Next point, number 5, something that I think is not emphasized enough: physical fitness. Obviously, it's imperative for the Vendée Globe, where you're sailing this monster boat. And the Open 60 has 80% more sail area than a TV52, 90% of the sail area of a Volvo 65, but you don't have the crowds of crew, and you don't have the short race lengths that they have. I get to say that now. They're the right to say that. I trained for 2 years with Marty Shea, who was an athlete in Marblehead. She was an All-American distance runner at Boston University, and then turned into a world champion cyclist. And she had the ethic, it was sort of the same ethic as I was talking about for the shipyards on the shore crew. She said very directly, if you don't come home, I don't want it ever to be on my conscience that your fitness level had anything to do with it. So I'm going to work you really hard. And she did. And I'm not sure if this is still on. Sounds like it's off, but so I'll just speak up. So at the time of starting the Vendée Globe, we're required to have a multitude of medical tests by the Vendée Globe race organization, and my cardiovascular stress test at age 66 put me at the high level for a 29-year-old. So that was really good, but to me, if you've done everything you can possibly do, then that helps my confidence level at sea. And as I said, fear is in there all the time, so you just can't be overconfident at all. You'd hate to die because you didn't do the last chin-up in practice. And I think also, if you go offshore on a full crew, you don't want to think, particularly given like the age graph we've seen at the cruising club, you don't want to think, oh, well, if we really get in trouble, some of those young guys will something to say today. Because what happens if they get sick? What happens if they get hurt? And you certainly can have either one of those happen. So we all want to be in as good physical shape as we can. We want to be able to do all the jobs on board. The last point is learn to speak French. Go to France and see what goes on over there. They have so much ocean racing, it's amazing. They have, as they say in some of the big leagues, they have a deep bench because they have so much short-handed sailing. They have so many sailors who are skilled in many different aspects of going offshore. They're super friendly. They're doing it all the time. They want to help. I learned so much just from being over there in that environment. In addition, they have these great races. And so many, I just learned about another transatlantic race that I've never heard of. They have, you know, we think of going over and the fastest races, like that's the big race, and it is. It's a big race. They have a race called the Solitaire de Figaro that's in 33-foot boats, strict one design, solo offshore, 4 legs, 500 miles each. In 2015, the fastest race, of course, was leg 3. 2 days later, they go off on leg 4, another 500 miles up the English Channel, across the Bay of Biscay somewhere. It's just unbelievable what goes on over there. And I think also they, because of this focus on offshore, it's like the rules precede the designers. And for instance, the Open 60 is probably the safest boat around. It's a monster to sail, but it has a requirement to be unsinkable. It has to have physical buoyancy of 130% of the displacement of the boat. So you can fill up every one of those watertight bulkheads. There's 5 watertight bulkheads, 6 watertight compartments. We've got 10 ballast tanks. If they're all empty, they're essentially watertight compartments. You can fill that entire boat up with water with this 3-ton keel at the bottom, and it's not going anywhere. And that's a pretty nice thing to go to sea on, some boat like that. So perhaps the race rules might be able to push into the design phase and make all the boats that we sail safer. Last point, mileage, mileage, mileage. That's it.